1847. Deep South, United States. In 1847, the American South was not merely divided by geography, but by power. Vast stretches of land were controlled by a small elite whose authority reached far beyond the boundaries of law or morality. Plantations functioned as private empires, isolated, self-governed territories where the will of one man outweighed the lives of hundreds. To outsiders, these estates symbolized prosperity. White pillared houses stood tall against the southern sun, surrounded by carefully maintained grounds and endless fields. Carriages arrived, guests were entertained, and society praised the refinement of plantation life. But this image was carefully constructed. Beneath it existed a system sustained by fear, silence, and absolute domination. The plantation owner was not simply a landholder. He was judge, lawmaker, and executioner combined. His word carried more weight than any distant court or constitution. On his land there were no witnesses, only subjects. What happened within the plantation rarely escaped its borders, and when it did, it was filtered through wealth, influence, and deliberate omission. Slavery was not enforced solely through chains or whips. Its true power lay in inevitability. Enslaved people understood from childhood that resistance was futile, that the law would never recognize their suffering, and that even death could be justified as property loss rather than human tragedy. This knowledge crushed rebellion before it could take form. The owner of this plantation was widely respected in public life. He attended church regularly, donated to civic causes, and maintained relationships with politicians and businessmen. Newspapers described him as disciplined, orderly, and morally upright. Yet respectability was a performance. Behind closed doors, his authority knew no restraint. On the plantation, power expressed itself differently, but no less destructively. Wealth created distance, not warmth. Silence ruled the corridors. Every gesture was measured against reputation. Appearances mattered more than well-being, and deviation was treated as disgrace. The owner's household was governed by the same principles he applied to his land: control, utility, and image. Even family members were evaluated not as individuals, but as extensions of his authority. His daughter grew up within this cold structure. She was surrounded by luxury, yet deprived of comfort. Servants attended to her needs, but affection was scarce. From a young age, she understood that her value was conditional. In a society obsessed with physical ideals and social presentation, her body marked her as a problem. She did not fit the image expected of elite Southern womanhood. Her appearance became a source of embarrassment rather than concern. She was not introduced proudly to visitors. She was not encouraged to participate in society. Instead, she was gradually hidden. Rooms became boundaries. Conversations stopped when she entered. Invitations were redirected. Over time, her existence became something to manage rather than embrace. Shame in that world was not treated as a human burden. It was treated as failure. The plantation owner viewed the situation through the same lens he used for everything else: ownership. Problems were not solved emotionally, they were controlled. If something threatened reputation, it had to be removed, repurposed, or silenced. This mindset extended seamlessly to the enslaved population. To him, enslaved people were not human beings capable of consent or suffering. They were assets, resources that existed to serve his needs. Their bodies, labor, and futures were commodities. This belief was not unique. It was normalized, reinforced by law, economy, and religion. The system did not merely allow cruelty, it rewarded it. The enslaved man central to this story was recorded only through fragments. No name, no biography, no voice. He existed in records as labor, not life. This erasure itself reflects the violence of the era. He understood survival meant obedience. Do not attract attention. Do not resist. Do not speak unless spoken to. His safety depended not on strength, but on invisibility. The plantation owner understood something equally dangerous, that his power was complete. No authority would challenge him. No neighbor would intervene. No institution would question his decisions. The system existed to protect men like him. This certainty removed hesitation. It is important to understand that what followed was not an act of sudden madness. It was the logical outcome of unchecked power. When authority faces no resistance, morality becomes optional. When morality disappears, the unimaginable becomes plausible. Plantations were designed to produce this outcome. They were environments where dominance replaced empathy and control replaced conscience. The system did not create monsters by accident, it created them by design. Evenings on the plantation were deceptively peaceful. Fields lay quiet. Lamps glowed softly through tall windows. From a distance, nothing appeared disturbed. Yet beneath that calm, decisions were forming. Decisions shaped not by compassion, but by entitlement. The story that followed was not driven by desire, it was driven by control. It was not about emotion, but about ownership. It demonstrated how easily human lives could be sacrificed to preserve reputation. And it began here, on land where no one could say no. 1847. The same plantation. By 1847, the plantation had already learned how to keep secrets. The daughter's presence within the house was never openly denied, yet never acknowledged either. She existed in the spaces between silence and avoidance. Her footsteps echoed through hallways that no longer welcomed her. Servants spoke to her with careful politeness, never lingering, never engaging beyond necessity. She was neither mistress nor child. She was something unresolved. From an early age, she sensed it. Children often understand rejection long before they can name it. She learned it in the way her father's gaze slid past her, in the way mirrors were covered or moved, in the way dresses were chosen not for celebration, but concealment. Her body became a problem she was expected to manage quietly. In the rigid hierarchy of Southern society, a woman's worth was measured by presentation. Beauty, grace, marriageability, these were not personal traits, but social currency. And her body, judged constantly, marked her as unfit for display. She was not cruel, she was not defiant, she simply existed in a form that embarrassed a man who valued control above all else. Her isolation was gradual, almost polite. She was encouraged to stay indoors. Social visits became rare. Tutors replaced gatherings. Music filled rooms that no longer hosted conversation. Over time, she disappeared from public memory without ever leaving the house. The plantation adjusted. Silence closed around her like a second skin. Her father never spoke openly about her condition. To do so would invite judgment, and judgment threatened authority. Instead, he reframed the situation internally, not as a failure of compassion, but as a logistical issue. Problems required solutions. This was how he viewed everything. The same logic that governed crop yields and labor discipline now turned inward. If her existence threatened reputation, then reputation must be protected at any cost. The emotional consequences were irrelevant. The system had never taught him to value them. Within the enslaved quarters, rumors moved faster than facts. The enslaved lived close enough to observe patterns, yet far enough to never receive explanations. They noticed when food trays were redirected, when certain rooms were locked, when night routines changed. They understood that silence often preceded cruelty. The enslaved man in the center of this story noticed these shifts. He was accustomed to being summoned without explanation. Orders did not require justification, but this request felt different, not in words, but in atmosphere. The house itself seemed tense, heavy with unspoken expectation. He did not ask questions. Questions had never been rewarded. The daughter, meanwhile, had been living under a different kind of confinement. Her isolation was not enforced through chains, but through shame. She had internalized the idea that her body was something to apologize for. She believed herself to be a burden, an obstacle to her father's pride. This belief shaped her silence more effectively than any command. When her father finally addressed her directly, his tone was calm. He spoke of solutions, of arrangements, of discretion. He did not speak of choice. For her, confusion blended with fear. She had never been prepared for agency. Her life had been structured entirely by expectation and avoidance. Now, suddenly, attention returned, but not as care, as correction. The plantation owner framed his decision as necessary. He believed necessity absolved him. In his mind, responsibility overweighed morality. He had convinced himself that what he planned was practical, not cruel. This is how systems of power function. They allow individuals to rewrite violence as duty. The enslaved man understood none of the broader reasoning. He was given instructions, not context. Compliance was assumed. Consent was irrelevant. His humanity had never factored into decisions before. It would not begin now. Both individuals were trapped, though the world would only ever recognize one cage. The daughter's fear was quiet. It did not manifest in screams or resistance. It lived in sleepless nights, in trembling hands, in the growing realization that her father's authority extended even into her body's fate. She had been raised to obey. Disobedience was never modeled as an option. The plantation owner misunderstood her silence for acceptance. This misunderstanding was not accidental. It was convenient. Within the logic of his world, enslaved people existed without autonomy, and women existed under guardianship. Combining these beliefs allowed him to rationalize actions that, outside the plantation, would have been unthinkable. But the plantation was its own universe. Church sermons spoke of order, laws reinforced hierarchy, society rewarded appearances. Within that framework, accountability dissolved. The emotional toll on the daughter was invisible to everyone but herself. She experienced a profound disconnection, not just from others, but from her own identity. She had been reduced to a problem to be solved, not a person to be protected. The enslaved man experienced something different, but equally devastating: erasure. He was treated as an instrument, stripped of choice, expected to comply without recognition of consequence. Neither was given language to resist. This is what made the situation so dangerous, not violence alone, but inevitability. The plantation owner did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as decisive. He believed leadership required difficult choices. The suffering of others was an unfortunate side effect, not a moral concern. This belief allowed him to sleep at night. As arrangements were finalized, the plantation continued its routines. Crops were tended, meals were served, life proceeded outwardly unchanged. This normalcy masked the gravity of what was unfolding. History often hides its darkest moments beneath ordinary days. The daughter retreated further into herself.
Her world narrowed to walls and windows. She understood that resistance would not be heard. The structures around her had never been built to listen. The enslaved man returned to his quarters carrying a weight he could not articulate. He knew only that compliance was expected and that refusal was not an option. Fear traveled quietly through the plantation, not noticed by those in power. This was not a story of impulse. It was a story of preparation, of decisions layered carefully until no single moment appeared monstrous on its own. That is how atrocities survive history. They are broken into steps, each justified by context until the outcome feels inevitable. The plantation owner believed he had resolved a problem. In reality, he had revealed the true cost of unchecked authority. And neither the daughter nor the enslaved man would ever fully escape the consequences of that moment, though history would remember neither of them by name.
1847. Still the same plantation. The plantation did not pause to acknowledge what was unfolding within its walls. Morning arrived, as it always did. The fields demanded labor. Bells rang. Orders were given. To those outside the house, nothing appeared different. This was how the system protected itself, by absorbing cruelty into routine until it became indistinguishable from daily life. Inside the house, silence thickened. The daughter's days blurred together. Time lost meaning when nothing was expected of her except compliance. No one explained what was happening in terms she could challenge. Explanations were not offered. Decisions were delivered. Her father spoke less now, not because of doubt, but because he believed the matter resolved. Silence in his world signified order. The enslaved man was summoned when needed and dismissed when not. Each interaction stripped away another layer of identity. He was no longer addressed as an individual, only as a function. His presence in the house was treated as procedural, not personal. This distinction mattered to those in power. It allowed them to proceed without acknowledging consequence. The act itself was never named. There was no language for it within the plantation's moral framework. Naming something requires recognition, and recognition invites accountability. Instead, the event existed in fragments, unspoken, undocumented, carefully avoided. This absence of language was deliberate. The daughter did not experience what happened as a single moment, but as a collapse, a slow realization that her body no longer belonged to her, that her father's authority extended beyond protection into possession. The emotional impact was profound, reshaping her understanding of safety, family, and self. She did not scream. She did not resist in ways that history records. Her response was inward, a shutting down, a retreat into silence deeper than before. This internal collapse was invisible to those who chose not to see it. The enslaved man experienced something else entirely, the complete erasure of agency. He had never been granted choice, but now even the illusion of humanity was stripped away. He was treated as a means to an end, an object used to serve a private objective. His thoughts, fear, and trauma were irrelevant within the system's logic. Neither consent nor refusal existed as concepts applicable to him. What made this moment particularly disturbing was not violence alone, but normalization. Servants continued their duties, meals were served, rooms were cleaned. Everyone understood that something had occurred, yet no one spoke of it. This collective silence was not accidental, it was survival. On plantations, speaking out did not correct injustice, it invited punishment. Enslaved people knew that witnessing wrongdoing did not grant them moral authority, it increased their vulnerability. Silence was safer than truth. Even among the household staff, avoidance became routine. Eyes lowered, paths adjusted, conversations shortened. The house itself seemed to conspire in forgetting. The plantation owner interpreted this quiet as confirmation. No one challenged him. No consequences followed. His authority remained intact. This reinforced his belief that his decision had been justified. In systems of unchecked power, lack of resistance is mistaken for approval. He did not see the emotional ruin left behind, or perhaps he saw it and dismissed it as acceptable loss. History shows us that cruelty often survives not because people are unaware, but because acknowledging it would require dismantling the systems that benefit them. The daughter withdrew further from the world. Her isolation deepened, no longer enforced solely by her father, but by her own psyche. Trust dissolved, identity fractured. She struggled to reconcile the image of her father as protector with his role as architect of her suffering. This internal conflict haunted her more than the act itself. She could not name what had happened, because naming it would require confronting its meaning. Instead, she lived with it silently, carrying a weight she was never meant to bear alone. The enslaved man returned to his quarters changed. Not visibly, perhaps, but internally, something had broken. Trauma did not announce itself dramatically. It manifested in quiet ways: disrupted sleep, hypervigilance, emotional withdrawal. Yet even these symptoms were dangerous. Any deviation from expected behavior could be punished. So he learned to hide his pain. The plantation offered no space for healing. There were no witnesses willing to listen, no authorities willing to intervene. The system functioned precisely as designed, to absorb suffering without acknowledgement. This is what complicity looks like. It is not always loud or intentional. Often it is passive. It is the choice to continue routines rather than confront injustice. It is the decision to prioritize stability over morality. The broader community never learned the details. Rumors circulated, vague and distorted, but rumors alone do not disrupt power. Without evidence, without names, without voices, truth remains powerless. Church sermons continued to preach order and obedience. Newspapers praised plantation prosperity. Universities debated morality in abstract terms while ignoring realities unfolding in plain sight. Society at every level participated in the erasure. The plantation owner remained respected, his reputation untouched, his authority unquestioned. The system rewarded him with silence. This lack of consequence is what allowed such acts to persist historically. When cruelty carries no cost, it becomes policy rather than exception. The daughter's life narrowed further. Her future, already limited, now felt impossible. Marriage, social presence, autonomy, all faded into abstraction. She existed in a suspended state, alive but unseen. The enslaved man continued to work. There was no space for grief, no allowance for trauma. Productivity mattered more than humanity. His labor resumed as if nothing had changed, reinforcing the system's message: suffering does not interrupt progress. Yet internally, both carried scars that history would never record. This is the tragedy of unnamed acts. Without documentation, pain becomes invisible. Without visibility, accountability disappears. The plantation survived,
The crops were harvested, profits were made, life moved forward. But something fundamental had been revealed. The system that allowed one man to decide the fate of others without consequence was not broken. It was functioning exactly as intended. And that realization casts a long shadow over everything that followed.
(1847 to 1848), the same plantation, the same silence. What followed was not chaos, it was continuation. History often teaches us to expect consequences after wrongdoing, exposure, punishment, moral reckoning. But on the plantation, consequence took a different form. It was quieter, slower, more enduring. Life did not collapse after what had occurred. It reorganized itself around the damage. The plantation owner resumed his routines with unsettling ease. He attended meetings, oversaw harvests, and maintained his public image. If guilt visited him, it left no visible mark. The system had assured him of his safety long before the act itself. In environments where power is absolute, conscience becomes optional. Within the household, adjustments were made, not to heal, but to conceal. Certain rooms were avoided, schedules shifted, servants were instructed without explanation. The goal was not restoration, but stability. Stability in this context meant pretending nothing had changed. The daughter became quieter, not withdrawn in a way that invited concern, but diminished, her presence thinning until it barely registered. She moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to disturb, careful not to remind anyone of what they preferred to forget. Her isolation was no longer imposed solely by her father. It had become internalized. She learned that silence kept her safe, or at least unnoticed. Speaking would require language she did not possess and courage she had never been taught to cultivate. She began to disappear emotionally long before she disappeared socially. Her health declined, though no physician was summoned to ask why. Physical symptoms were treated as inconveniences. Emotional distress was not recognized as illness, it was labeled weakness. And weakness, especially in women, was expected to endure quietly. The enslaved man continued to work under the same sun, in the same fields, under the same overseers. His labor did not slow, his obedience did not waver. From the outside, he appeared unchanged. This was by design. Any visible sign of distress would have attracted scrutiny. Scrutiny could lead to punishment. Punishment could lead to death. Survival required performance, appearing unaffected, compliant, useful. Trauma in such conditions had to be hidden deeply. He spoke less, he slept poorly, he avoided spaces associated with the house whenever possible. Yet none of this was recorded. Enslaved suffering rarely was. Pain that cannot be documented is easily denied. Around them, the plantation community maintained its collective silence. Other enslaved people noticed changes, but understood the danger of curiosity. Whispered observations never became questions. No one sought explanations they could not afford to hear. This was not apathy, it was survival. Among the white household staff, discomfort manifested differently. Some avoided eye contact, others overcompensated with forced normalcy. No one confronted the owner. Confrontation required power, and power was unevenly distributed. Silence, again, proved safer than truth. The broader society remained untouched. Neighbors continued their visits, clergy offered sermons on obedience and order.
Local newspapers praised agricultural success and moral leadership. No rumors reached a level that demanded investigation. And even if they had, investigations into plantation households rarely challenged owners. Authority protected itself. This absence of justice was not accidental, it was structural. Legal systems of the era did not recognize enslaved people as victims. Women, especially within households, were considered under male guardianship. This dual erasure created a perfect vacuum. No crime could exist where no victim was acknowledged. The plantation owner understood this implicitly. He had been raised within it. He benefited from it daily. What occurred did not threaten him, it confirmed his position. The daughter's future narrowed until it felt non-existent. Marriage, once considered a possibility, faded from discussion. Social appearances ceased entirely. Her life became confined to the plantation, then to the house, then to a handful of rooms. She was alive, but not living. This slow erasure is rarely dramatized in history books. It lacks spectacle, but its impact is profound. To exist without recognition is a form of disappearance that leaves no grave to visit. The enslaved man's life followed a different path, but one equally constrained. He aged faster than his years suggested. The burden of unspoken trauma settled into his body. Yet the plantation measured his worth only in productivity. As long as he worked, nothing else mattered. He could not seek comfort, he could not seek justice, he could not seek meaning. His existence was defined by endurance alone. The plantation thrived economically. Crops yielded profit, trade continued, wealth accumulated. This prosperity further insulated the owner from scrutiny. Success was treated as moral validation. This is how systems excuse themselves. When outcomes are favorable for those in power, methods are rarely questioned. Suffering becomes invisible beneath profit margins. The daughter's name began to disappear from conversation entirely. New guests never learned it. Old acquaintances stopped asking. Her absence was normalized. Eventually, even memory began to fade. The enslaved man's name, if it ever existed in records, was never preserved. He joined the countless others reduced to numbers, roles, or vague references. His pain, like theirs, was absorbed into anonymity. Years passed. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was repaired. The damage did not demand attention because it did not disrupt order. This is one of history's cruelest truths. Injustice does not require chaos to persist. It requires only acceptance. The plantation owner aged into respectability. His decisions were never challenged publicly. He was remembered as disciplined, successful, authoritative. The daughter was remembered, if at all, as unfortunate. The enslaved man was not remembered at all. What survived was the system, a system that allowed harm without consequence, a system that rewarded silence, a system that transformed cruelty into routine. This is not the story of one man's actions alone. It is the story of how entire communities enable harm by refusing to see it. And it leads us to the final, unsettling reality, that history does not always punish its villains. Sometimes it simply looks away.
1849 and beyond, the same land, the same silence. History did not record a conclusion. There was no trial, no confession, no reckoning written in ink. What remained was absence of answers, of accountability, of names. The plantation continued to exist long after the people most affected by its decisions faded from view.
Time moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to unresolved pain. The daughter's fate became a matter of speculation rather than fact. Some said she remained within the house, living out her days in isolation, her world reduced to quiet rooms and distant sounds. Others believed she was sent away quietly, absorbed into relatives' households where her past could be conveniently forgotten. What is certain is that she never re-entered public life. No records speak of her marriage, no announcements celebrate milestones, no portraits mark her presence in family history. She became a blank space, an omission so complete that later generations would struggle to confirm she existed at all. This erasure was not accidental, it was intentional. Families of power often curate their histories carefully, preserving triumphs and burying contradictions. In doing so, they shape legacy rather than truth. The daughter's story did not fit the narrative of respectability, and so it was removed. The plantation owner's legacy endured. Land deeds survived, financial records persisted. His name appeared in church donations and local histories. He was remembered as a man of discipline, success, and influence. His authority, once absolute, softened into respectability as years passed. Death, when it came, did not ask questions. Obituaries do not catalog cruelty, they summarize public achievement. In death, he was praised for maintaining order, contributing to the economy, and upholding tradition. No mention was made of what happened within his walls. The enslaved man's fate was even harder to trace. If he survived those years, he likely continued working until age or illness reduced his usefulness. Perhaps he was sold. Perhaps he died unnamed, unrecorded, his existence folded into the countless others history chose not to document. Enslaved lives rarely left traces unless they disrupted systems. Survival alone was not enough to be remembered. His suffering did not generate paperwork. His trauma did not warrant investigation. His humanity did not require acknowledgement. This absence of documentation is itself evidence. It tells us what societies choose to value. It reveals whose pain is deemed worthy of record and whose is considered disposable. As decades passed, the plantation changed hands. Fields were reworked. Buildings deteriorated or were renovated. New generations walked the land unaware of what had occurred beneath their feet. Memory faded not because the past was resolved, but because it was inconvenient. This is how history often operates, not as an accurate account, but as a selective one. It prioritizes continuity over confrontation, comfort over complexity, legacy over justice. Even when slavery ended, the silence remained. Freedom did not retroactively restore voices that had been suppressed. Emancipation did not rewrite records or recover erased identities. Many stories were already lost by the time the system collapsed. The daughter's experience, shaped by privilege yet destroyed by control, fell between categories. She was neither celebrated nor acknowledged as a victim. Her suffering challenged the myth of benevolent authority and was therefore easier to forget. The enslaved man's experience fit a familiar pattern of erasure, one among millions whose lives were defined by labor and ended without recognition. His suffering merged into statistics, his individuality dissolved. What remains is the question history avoids asking. What happens when systems allow harm without consequence? The answer is not chaos, it is repetition. Unchecked power does not correct itself. It evolves, adapts, and reappears in new forms. The structures that enabled cruelty on plantations did not vanish overnight. They transformed into laws, social hierarchies, and unspoken norms that continued to shape lives. This story matters not because it is unique, but because it is representative. It reveals how authority, when insulated from accountability, can redefine morality to suit its needs. It shows how silence becomes complicity and how entire communities participate in harm by refusing to name it. The absence of closure is not a failure of storytelling, it is the truth of history. Many victims never receive justice. Many perpetrators die respected. Many witnesses choose comfort over courage. And many stories end not with resolution, but with disappearance. The plantation stands as a symbol, not of one man's actions, but of a system's capacity to absorb cruelty and continue unchanged. When we ask what became of the daughter, we confront the limits of historical record. When we ask what became of the enslaved man, we confront the moral cost of forgetting. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the system did not break because of what happened. It survived because of it. It adapted, normalized, and moved forward. And that survival challenges us to reconsider how we understand progress. Ending a system does not undo its damage. Removing laws does not restore lost voices. Time alone does not heal what was never acknowledged. The absence of closure is the final truth of this story. There is no redemption offered here, no moral balance restored, only the recognition that history often leaves its deepest wounds unexamined. What we are left with is responsibility, to notice what was erased, to question what was normalized, to understand that silence, too, is an action, and to ask ourselves, quietly, uncomfortably, what other stories ended like this, simply because no one chose to speak?